Welcome back once again, football fans, and welcome to part 2 of our look at the career of the phenom known as LT Lawrence Taylor. If you haven't checked out part 1, I suggest you do so before you watch this video. The link is in the description and also in the top corner of the video screen. But for a quick recap, LT has played 6 amazing seasons in the NFL at this point and has pretty much done it all. 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards, 6 consecutive Pro Bowl selections, for Team All-Pro selections, also 6 times straight, and in his 6th season, had one of the greatest seasons ever, where he won all these awards, led the league in quarterback sacks, and became the first defensive player in 15 years, and the last as of 2021, to be named League MVP. And as the man the team pinned their hopes on dating back to 1981, as the Giants were still the league's biggest jokes, they built the team around him and were victorious in Super Bowl 21 over the Denver Broncos, giving LT a Super Bowl ring. Now, how's he going to top all this? I mean, as a matter of fact, a quote from him pretty much answered that very same question. Well, sort of. When the Super Bowl was over, everyone was so excited, but by then I felt deflated. I'd won every award, had my best season, and finally won the Super Bowl. I was on top of the world, right? So what could be next? Nothing. The thrill is the chase to get to the top. Every day the excitement builds and builds and builds, and when you're finally there and the game is over, and then nothing. There you go. Pretty bleak words from LT, but at the same time, understandable. Be that as it may, however, the Giants are still the Super Bowl champions and looking poised to repeat in 1987. Most of the team was still intact, and Bill Parcells was still leading the way in what would be his 5th season as the team's head coach. Bill Belichick was the defensive coordinator still at this point to boot. So now the Giants' quest to go back-to-back was ready. But what would LT's mindset be? Well, to open the season, it was a huge Monday night game in Chicago against the Bears, who were eager to get back to the top of the mountain themselves. But their star offensive line keeps the Giants at bay, and Sims would be sacked 8 times. The Bears still had an incredible defense at this point, and the Giants would lose 34-19. The Giants then lost to the Cowboys due to a late field goal, 16-14. Though they got to Danny White quite a few times, and included 1 sack from LT, but now the Giants were 0-2 to start the season. And then they face a new obstacle. Another strike. Yes, a player strike hit the league big time, which only caused 1 week in a season in operations, unlike the 1982 strike. But that's because they were prepping for replacement players to take over. And believe me, it's not as fun as a Keanu Reeves movie might make it sound. The Giants continued to falter, with losses to the Niners and the Redskins, and were outscored a combined 79-33. And hey, LT will be LT, as he ruffles a lot of feathers once again. He crossed the picket line. His reason? The Giants are losing, and I am losing $60,000 a week. I mean, you can interpret that as selfish, or simply the fact that the man hates losing, or he wants money to supply his habits, he missed the game, or all of the above. Either way, this angered many of his teammates, but in typical LT fashion, he of course didn't care. He returned for a game against the Buffalo Bills, and of course dominated as he had 2 sacks in the game, but the Giants fell to 0-5, in a very ugly 6-3 loss. A local radio host made a joke about news reporters getting that mixed up with the game between the Sabres and Rangers. But by the time that game was played, the strike was pretty much over, and at 0-5, however, the Giants' chances for the playoffs were not looking good. And the Giants would finally win their first game, 30-7, with the return of their overall lineup over the Cardinals, but then the Giants would lose another one, this one to the Cowboys, 33-24. They did bounce back with a 17-10 win over the New England Patriots, as the Giants' defense looks on point, and LT gets the veteran QB Steve Grogan twice. And then the Giants won their 2nd in a row, due to a late field goal beating the Eagles 20-17, and LT had 2 more sacks. And then they drop a 23-14 and 23-19 losses respectively to the Saints and Redskins. The Redskins game ended LT's streak 106 consecutive games played, never having missed a game yet in his career. And of course, we're not counting the 2 replacement player games he missed, as he suffered a hamstring injury in this one, and the Giants fell to 3-8, effectively eliminating them from playoff contention. LT, however, returned and took out his frustration of the Giants about to miss the playoffs on Randall Cunningham. The Giants managed to beat the Eagles 23-20. After a loss to the Cardinals and a win over the Packers, LT walked away with each sack in a game, and the Giants end the season by beating the Jets 20-7. The Giants missed the playoffs for the first time since 1983, and for LT, the 3rd time in his career. 12 sacks in 12 games during a season full of problems. It's nothing to sneeze at. And his new favorite target, Randall Cunningham, dubiously picking up where his predecessor, Ron Jaworski, left off, eats 3 of them. He got to Neil Lomax, another prominent target of his, and to boot, former Pro Bowler Danny White, who was nearing the end of his career. but saw some rare targets. In LT's first game against the Pats, he gets the 13-year veteran Steve Grogan twice, as well as Randy Wright, easy for me to say, the short-lived Packers prospect that never panned out, and even got to replacement QB Brian McClure twice with the Bills. For only the second time in his career, LT didn't register a single vote for the Defensive Player of the Year, and his streak of first-team All-Pro selections ends at 6, a huge shot to say the least. Now, this was still a good season, but you gotta understand the pedestal that LT was put on at this point, especially with the year he had in 1986. Some called this year a disappointment, because LT wasn't just another great player. At this point, he was beyond great. Some, myself included, say that's a ridiculous notion, but even though there are those who want to see you succeed at your greatness, there are just as many waiting for you and getting on your case once you fail in the slightest fashion. Despite LT's disappointing, and I say that with very heavy sarcasm, 1987, and the Giants becoming the 5th team in NFL history to win a Super Bowl and miss the playoffs, but, that being said, the Giants weren't a bad team, they had a bad year. Most of the team was still intact, but many things led them to falter the year before. One, Phil Simms and his injury issues. But now a huge issue would be, surprise, surprise, LT, and it had nothing to do with his stats or what he did on the field. It had to do with the fact that the season was about to get underway. He failed a drug test testing positive for cocaine. He was suspended by the NFL for 30 days, meaning he'd miss 4 games. This was his second violation of the league's substance abuse policy, and the first from the prior season that was actually kept under wraps. He avoided the press like the plague and checked into rehab. The Giants, for the first time in LT's career, be opened the season without him, and they opened the season with a win over Washington, a crushing late-game loss to the Niners, but then a tight win over the Cowboys and a high-scoring loss to the Rams. The Giants started the season 2-2 without their star, and the growing concern among the team, the media, and the fans about LT's reckless behavior was definitely making the rounds. But they were still anxious to see if he could come back and be the star he always has been. LT returned in a road game against defending Super Bowl champion Redskins and didn't lose a step. He was making the day hell for young QB Mark Rypien and brought him down for 2 sacks and looked to be in good spirits. Looked like he had the ferocity and the focus he had in 1986. And the Giants won a thriller, 24-23. However, despite LT showing that same intensity the following week against the Eagles, obtaining another sack, the Giants lost 24-13 and were 3-3. The Giants began to look like the team they were on paper going on a 4-game winning streak, and LT was tearing up offensive lines and QBs. It began with a 30-10 throttling of the Detroit Lions, where LT had 3 sacks as the Giants were on the warpath. Next, it was a 23-16 win thanks to a stunning interception TD return from Carl Banks late in the game. It took OT this time, however, to beat the Lions 13-10, as LT again planted Rusty Hilger to the turf twice more. And the lowly Cowboys and their fall from grace continued with a 29-21 loss to the Giants, and LT hitting 2 different QBs for 2 sacks. 4 wins in a row, 7 sacks. The Giants stood at 7-3 and looked like they were about to finally pick up where they left off after their championship season in 1986. And LT was silencing the naysayers who said he lost a step in 1987. They sat in first place with the Cardinals and Redskins lurking behind, with the growing Eagles squad still not quite out of it. And then a game against the Phoenix Cardinals, a big game, their first season in Arizona. LT, who usually got in the face of Neil Lomax throughout his career, failed to do so in this game. The Giants would lose 24-17. Then another team from the Bird family, the Eagles, delivered a heartbreaking loss to the Giants in overtime after a blocked field goal return ended the game. And even though LT was continuing to have Cunningham's number, it just didn't result in a victory. Now the Giants had fallen to 7-5, and just like that, playoffs were an uncertainty now, as now there was a 3-way tie between the Giants, Eagles, and Cardinals. The Redskins were still in contention to boot, and there was a bigger problem. LT was hurt. His intensity sadly got the better of him once again with a torn pectoral muscle, as well as some torn shoulder ligaments. And some expected him to miss an upcoming game against the New Orleans Saints, who, unlike years past, were now a playoff contender. And on November 27, 1988, in what would become known as the Pain Game, LT suited up. Footage was seen on TV of LT getting his shoulder in a brace, tightened up, knowing what was on the line here. Say what you want about this man and even everything he did earlier in the season, and believe me, it's likely true what you may say, but there's no doubt this man hated losing and wanted his team in the playoffs. Be it for selfish motives or not, everything he did in his career, or any given Sunday or the odd Monday, benefited his team. Early in the game, he made his presence felt with a forced fumble, and even on another play, despite being injured and triple teamed, he was able to put the pressure on Bobby Hebert, the Saints QB, in the pocket. And it should be noted that the Saints had the 5th best blocking core in the league to boot. The Saints got so desperate in trying to contain LT, they resorted to holding penalties. You could see him writhing in pain once he hit the turf after many plays, but he continued to bulldoze the blockers, stop the oncoming running game from getting any momentum, pressuring Hebert, going back on pass coverage. He was playing the game of his life while going through the worst injury of his career. But sadly, the Saints still led 6-0 in the second quarter after 2 field goals. The Giants did get a touchdown to take the lead, but the Saints led 9-7 in the half. But then in the third quarter, he got to him again, sacking him for another fumble, and the Giants recovered. I should also note that the Giants' offense in this game was playing very poorly, as Sims again was hurt, and the 2 backup QBs, the Jeff duo of Rutledge and Hostetler, were not producing. With every passing play, Taylor seemed to be more and more pain, but he would pressure Hebert more and more as well, who would then get a short pass completed, but then LT would then run to where the receiver was and make the tackle, hurting himself in the process, just doing anything he could to contain the Saints from gaining yardage. And in the fourth quarter, the Giants were finally in this game. Late in it, he hit Hebert with his 3rd sack of the game. The Giants would win the game with a late field goal in the dying seconds, 13-12, and LT's performance was given high praise in the media all over the NFL. 3 sacks, 7 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, and the Giants to boot are hungering for the playoffs. And they could still win the division title. Even Coach Bill Parcells called it one of the greatest performances he ever witnessed. If anyone ever questioned the heart of Lawrence Taylor on the field when it matters most, just take a look at this very game. Now, you think he'd take a break after that, right? Well, nope. He suited up for a home game against Phoenix, and the Giants won 44-7. And then he hit 2 sacks on a man he hadn't faced in quite some time, but had luck against in the past, Steve DeBerg, now QBing for the Chiefs, and again nailed him with those 2 sacks in a huge 28-12 win. But the Giants, despite their 3rd straight win, weren't quite out of the woods yet. They still led the division, but could still lose it all. The Eagles could still win the division with a win in their final week and a Giants loss. The Giants would have to beat their stadium rivals, the Jets, and if the Giants win, they clinch regardless of the Eagles game, as they face the lowly Dallas Cowboys, however, so victory for the Eagles looks almost very certain. Both games had all eyes from fans on both sides on them on Sunday, December 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. After the first quarter, it didn't look good for the Giants, down 10-0. However, the Eagles weren't looking that great either, down 7-0 to the Cowboys. The Jets, however, went up by 13. Giants got a huge, important score with a Steve Baker touchdown and trail 13-7 at the half. And the Eagles led 10-7 at the half against the Cowboys. The Jets got another touchdown, but the Giants responded and trailed 20-14 as LT was being held at bay, while the Eagles led 17-7 after the third quarter. It was not looking good. And finally, the Giants made a huge turning point. The fourth quarter touchdown from Lionel Manuel and led 21-20. But the Jets scored the win, and the Giants lose the division. However, they weren't out of the playoffs quite yet. They awaited the result of the Rams-49ers game. If the Rams lose, the Giants will get a wild card spot. However, the Rams won in an upset, and the Giants' season ends in heartbreak. His 15.5 sacks were 3rd best in the league behind Kevin Green and Reggie White. 2 future Pro Bowlers with 5 sacks, and 2 men on top 10 blocking teams. The 2 sacks on Ripien, who was well protected by the Redskins Hogs. And of course, we can't forget the infamous Payne game, where he overcame the Saints' top-notch offensive line and got those 3 sacks on Bobby Hebert. He had 5 sacks on the lowly Lions QB Rusty Hilger, and 1.5 on Randall Cunningham, who was a Pro Bowler that year. While veteran Steve DeBerg and Dallas' clueless QBs also incurred his wrath. LT finished 6th in votes for Defensive Player of the Year with 6 votes. Back in the swing of things, shouting out many naysayers. So, his 3rd best 15.5 sacks were added by the fact that he silenced the naysayers with his 7th first-team All-Pro selection and 8th straight Pro Bowl. 6th in Defensive Player of the Year voting, 3rd in sacks. And his performance in that memorable Payne game showed the player he truly was. He also seemed to overcome his substance abuse issues on the surface, and still showed he was at the top of his game. In 1989, the Giants had a goal, and that was to erase the 2 seasons of disappointment and get back to the Super Bowl. But there was some huge changes on the defensive side of things. George Martin had retired. and so did future Hall of Famer Harry Carson. Also, Jim Burt was pretty much forced to retire by the Giants organization due to back problems, but he decided he wasn't done and went to San Francisco. But on the linebacking core, LT still had Carl Banks, Pepper Johnson, and Gary Reasons. Terry Kennard still led the secondary, and new stars were emerging such as Mark Collins, the still reliable Perry Williams. Burt Oates, on the offensive side of things, led on a reliable offensive line, which included a man who had a great name for the offensive line, Jumbo Elliott, who became a big fan favorite in New York, no pun intended. They also lost running back Joe Morris, but they did have former Cardinals star running back Otis Anderson, but he had battled injuries and inconsistent play, and had been on the Giants for 2 seasons now, but you'd barely notice. And it looked like Phil Simms was back to form too, however, so that was some good news. So reviews were mixed on the Giants going into the 1989 season, but it was certain LT was still at the top of what he could do. The Giants and LT start the season right with a huge 27-24 win over their division rival, the Redskins, and the only sack in the game is recorded by LT getting to Ripien. This began a huge 4-game win streak to start the season as a victory over the Skins. Then after that, they were able to contain rookie running back Barry Sanders and the Detroit Lions, and their otherwise weak offense other than Sanders was susceptible to LT barreling down in the whole game, recording 2.5 sacks. He then recorded another sack in a dominant 35-7 win over the Cardinals. And the lowly Cowboys were no match for the Giants, as they scored another dominant win, 30-13. However, the hot streak comes to an end in a game against a team who some are deeming the new kings of the NFC East, or the future kings at least, the Philadelphia Eagles. The Giants led 19-14 late, but the Eagles made a comeback, winning 21-19, but LT did manage to once again take down Randall Cunningham twice. But the Giants and LT shook that off with another 4-game winning streak. And it started again with the Redskins 20-17. They followed that with a 2013 win over the Chargers, and then LT had 2.5 sacks in a big win over the Vikings and recorded a monster 3 sacks on Gary Hogaboom, really love that name, in a 2013 win over the Cardinals. The New York Giants look amazing at 8-1, and the Eagles still, however, look like a threat. But the rest of the division seem to be faltering quite badly. However, the Giants' hot streak again came to an end, a screeching halt, if you will, at the hands of the Los Angeles Rams, 31-10. The Giants' defense had no answer for a highly talented Rams offense. Another pass rusher named Kevin Green made Phil Simms pay all day long. However, the Giants got back on track thanks to a big game from Marshall and a 15-3 win over the Seahawks, moving to 9-2. However, in a huge game with the defending Super Bowl champion San Francisco 49ers, bad news dealt to LT. He fractured his tibia, and the Giants also lost the game 34-24. And if that wasn't bad enough, they lose a huge game to the Eagles, meaning their grip on the division wasn't so tight anymore. And Lawrence also missed most of the game. He also hasn't had a sack in 4 games, but they are tied for first place. The Giants would win a tight defensive battle over the Denver Broncos 14-7, but the Eagles won that day as well over the Cowboys, and the division was still tied. However, it was the Giants' turn to make the one-win Cowboys their whipping boys, and LT played a beauty, sacking future Hall of Famer Troy Aikman, and was in his face significantly. But he still would have to sit a large portion of that game to boot. But the New York Giants were back in the playoffs, that's all that matters, and the Eagles suffered a big loss against the Saints, meaning the Giants were now in the driver's seat at least for another week. But the Giants could still lose the division, despite wrapping up, at the very least, a wild-card spot, but they wanted the division. And if the Eagles win and the Giants lose, the Eagles would get the tiebreaker rule due to a better conference record. Awaiting the Giants were the Raiders, a mediocre club who was still good enough to play spoiler, while the Eagles played their division rivals, the Cardinals. The odds favor the Giants a little more, and I think the Giants would win the division, a huge 34-17 win over the Raiders, and gritting through the pain for yet another game, 2 big sacks for LT. Despite his troubles off the field in recent years, he was inspiring teammates with his leadership and his determination to win. He was setting an amazing example. So, with the Giants making their first playoff appearance since their Super Bowl win, and their second division title in such time, they get a bye to the divisional round, and they will face a team that is, definitely game to the task of an upset, the Los Angeles Rams. They had a very talented offense led by efficient quarterback Jim Everett, running back 1,000-yard rusher Greg Bell, Pro Bowl receiver Henry Ellard, and the 7th best offensive line in the league led by Doug Smith, Duval Love, and Herb Pankey. Great names. On defense, you had mean Kevin Green, LT's counterpart. Also a fantastic secondary led up by Jerry Gray. The Rams actually upset the Eagles to get here. On the opening drive of the game, the Giants got on the board early with a field goal. It looked like it was going to be the Giants' day early, as LT sacked Everett, causing a fumble as Reasons recovers, but it still remained 3-0 after the first quarter. A second quarter field goal made it 6-0, but Gray deflected a Phil Simms pass, which landed into the hands of Michael Stewart. And on the next play, the Rams got their first touchdown of the game and led 7-6 at halftime. The LA offensive line was giving Everett ample time, and while LT did register another sack, they had trouble getting to him overall in the whole game. The secondary, however, did get to Everett as he threw a pick in the end zone in the third quarter that allowed the Giants to embark on an 82-yard, 14-play drive that killed significant time off the clock, culminated in an Otis Anderson touchdown. The Giants led 13-7 after 3. The Rams, however, in the fourth quarter closed the gap to 3 points. And with 3:01 to go, a 75-yard drive culminated in another field goal. 13-13, we are tied and out to overtime. The Rams got the first possession after 2 big completions to Henry Ellard, and the Giants committing a costly pass interference penalty. Everett made a huge play to Flipper Anderson, a man Giants still cursed to this very day, for a 30-yard TD. The Giants' season was over in heartbreak once again. It was the first time in LT's career that the Giants made the playoffs and didn't win a single game. Also, they didn't lose to the eventual champions this time either, as that would be the Rams, as their miracle run came to a screeching halt courtesy of the team who would win the Super Bowl in the NFC Championship, the 49ers. Despite battling injuries, LT still finished the year with 15 sacks, 7th in the league. Gary Hogeboom saw the number 56 4 times up close that year. He had many sacks total on rival division pivots, especially Mark Rypien and Randall Cunningham. And he also welcomed Hall of Fame QB Troy Aikman, future Hall of Famer that is, to the league in his rookie year. As a matter of fact, his sacks on Aikman and Rypien were on top 10 offensive lines, as the Skins Hogs were the second best. And despite their terrible 1-15 year, the Cowboys offensive line protected their new prospect very well. All but 6.5 sacks on Hogeboom and Gagliano were on QBs who were Pro Bowlers at one time or another. For only the third time, LT isn't in the voting for Defensive Player of the Year, but he was a first-team All-Pro for the 8th time in his career and second straight time. Again, his perseverance and leadership were what stood out above all this year, and he'd indeed be recognized for it. He obtained his 9th straight Pro Bowl selection and was 7th in sacks of the season. And get this, was named to the NFL's 1980s All-Decade Team. What a way to end what has been a great decade. And while he helped the Giants get back in the playoffs, the upset at the hands of the Rams will be on their minds going into the next season. As if missing the playoffs 2 years in a row isn't frustrating enough, finally making it back to the playoffs and getting upset by an underdog team is likely to be considered even worse. As LT prepared for his 10th season, he was a contract holdout, demanding a contract of $2 million per year. As the season was almost set to get underway, neither side was budging. He was actually being fined what was estimated to be $2,500 a day. I wouldn't mind that in a month. And with just 4 days to go before the season gets underway, LT signed a 3-year, $5 million deal. But he wasn't the only problem this year. Terry Kinnard was gone, now playing in Houston, but made a steal of a deal acquiring Renia Thompson from Miami at safety. Also, defensive tackle Eric Howard, while always reliable, looked to play a bigger role up front. Despite no preparation in training camp and not attending practices, LT began the season in a huge way, with 3 sacks as the Giants were able to topple their division rivals the Eagles 27-20, and this set the Giants on their way to a 10-game winning streak, beating with a big win over the Eagles. LT then greeted Troy Aikman with a 28-7 win over a growing Dallas Cowboys team. Also, for the first time in his career, LT came face-to-face with Dan Marino and shared a sack out of the deal. They then followed that with 4 straight wins over division rivals, Dallas, Washington, Phoenix, and Washington again. Then a dominant win over the lowly Colts. The pass rush was on their game, and LT was playing excellent football, though he hadn't recorded a sack since the Miami win. They got some revenge on the Rams as well, who'd fallen apart this season, and then shut out a win over the Lions, where LT had 1.5 sacks. 6 sacks in 10 games. Not too shabby at all, and still playing with a trademark insanity and intensity style. The Giants to boot are off to their best start in franchise history, and they had a very comfortable lead at 10-0 in the division, as the Eagles and the Redskins were the only real threats, but they were just at 6-4. But then the Giants dropped 2 straight losses, one to the Eagles and another to the 49ers. The latter was a very ugly 7-3 loss. However, LT and the boys bounced back with a huge 23-15 win over the Vikings, a team LT always does very well against, and this was no different, 2.5 sacks on youngster Rich Gannon. And with just one more win, the Giants would easily clinch the division. Even with the wildcard format now allowing 3 total seeds to qualify, the Giants team is already looking for the playoffs. They, however, lose to a powerful Buffalo Bills team, despite starter Jim Kelly not seeing a lot of playing time. LT, however, does sack backup Frank Reich, But the Giants come up short 17-13, and the Redskins win their game, meaning that the Giants could still lose the division, but yeah, it was kind of unlikely. And speaking of losing, however, this was a biggie. Phil Simms suffered a broken foot, effectively ending his season, and many felt the Giants, pinning their hopes on a talented yet unproven Jeff Hostetler, they were done for. Playoffs or not. But with the win over the Cardinals, the Giants did clinch the division, despite their lowly division rivals putting up a fight, their third division title in 5 seasons, and LT plays a beauty in the process. The Giants finished the season with a low-scoring late field goal win over the one-win Patriots. Without Simms, they weren't being given much of a chance to take it. But it doesn't matter. The Giants, either way, still get a bye to the divisional round, and they're still in the playoffs and ready to host the Chicago Bears, who they haven't faced in the playoffs since 1985 when the Bears won the Super Bowl. The team obviously had changed just a little bit, but legends such as Singletary, Dent, Mongo, The Fridge, and Hampton were still there on the defense. But newer faces such as defensive lineman Trace Armstrong and defensive back Donnell Woodford were welcome additions. Their offense was much different now, however, led by QB Mike Tomczak this time, 1,000-yard rusher Neil Anderson. However, the legendary Jimbo Covert was still there leading the offensive line. The Giants' defense just utterly destroyed the Bears. Anderson was held to just 19 yards, and the Bears only had 27 yards on the ground total. And the Giants possessed the ball nearly 3/4 of the game, thanks to their devastating defense not giving the Bears anything to work with. This was a strategy perfected by Bill Belichick. This was going to be key in the Giants' success if they were going to win this thing. LT, his backers, and the defensive line were incredible, and the Giants' running game scampered for close to 200 yards in a dominant 31-3 win. So yes, indeed, the journey back to prominence takes another huge step, and for the first time since 1986, the Giants are going to the NFC Championship. And how fitting is this? We get the big rubber match. The overall series, if you will, in the last decade is tied 2-2. And the Giants have a huge obstacle as they take on their biggest playoff rivals, the one team who finished better than them in the NFC that year with a 14-2 record, the two-time defending Super Bowl champions, the San Francisco 49ers, and it takes place by the Bay. And in his mid-30s, Niners QB Joe Montana was still in fine form. And the second half of that most dangerous combo in football, wide receiver Jerry Rice, was at his peak. They had a reliable backfield with Dexter Carter, Roger Craig, and Tom Rathman. Former Giant Jim Burt was on the defensive line. You had Pro Bowl linebacker Charles Haley joined by a very young Bill Romanowski on linebacking core, and veteran Ronnie Lott was still among the elite defensive backs in the league. Well, Montana seemed to open the game good enough for the Niners with a 10-play, 44-yard drive which culminated in a field goal. But then Hostetler, who may not have been putting up Simms' numbers, was using that kill-the-clock strategy and doing brilliantly with it. 15 plays, 69 yards, and a field goal of their own. It was tied 3-3 after the first quarter. The second quarter saw the Giants kill the clock more and make it 6-3, but the Niners' offense sprung to life. But they were again held to a field goal, and it was 6-6 at the half. In the third quarter, however, the Niners' offense shocked the Giants with a 61-yard touchdown pass and led 13-6, but Matt Baer hit his third field goal of the game, but would miss another, and the Giants trailed 13-9 at the end of 3 quarters. Former Giant Jim Byrd hit what appeared to be a dirty play on Hostetler, taking him out at the knees, seemingly injuring him, although Hostetler would return. It's never good to wake up a sleeping giant, or shall I say giants, pardon the pun. On a third down play for the 49ers, Montana was flushed out of the pocket as LT was barreling down on him. But Montana avoided him, but he didn't avoid Leonard Marshall, who drove Montana down, hitting him hard in the back. This was the hit that gave Montana 4 different injuries and put him out of action for nearly 2 years. Burt, of all people, should have known this is what would happen. Later, Gary Reasons made a great play, but not on defense. A direct snap on a fake punt led to him running 30 yards. But Hostetler, clearly playing hurt, couldn't get the ball in the end zone. Barr kicked another field goal. The Giants trailed 13-12. Time was ticking down with just 5:47 to go. Backup QB Steve Young came into the game for the Niners, and they looked to run as much time on the clock as they could. Roger Craig, who was always reliable in these late-game situations, carried the ball in a huge scrum ensued. A sea of humanity involving Giants and 49ers players resulted in Craig fumbling the ball, and the ball still in midair was grabbed by LT, and the Giants could still win this thing. It was a huge play from the Giants' defense. Hostetler remained focused, making some big plays. And with 4 seconds left, Giants fans biting their nails back in New York. Barr attempted a 42-yard field goal. The kick went up. It's good. The New York Giants are going back to the Super Bowl. The Giants controlled the clock. Eric Howard, who caused the fumble, LT, Hostetler, and Barr were all hailed as conquering heroes in what was considered an upset. The Giants made an emphatic statement, however, and some say on this day won at least this part of the rivalry. So now here we go. LT and the boys have a chance to regain their spot at the top of the NFL mountain, as the New York Giants will take on the Buffalo Bills in Super Bowl 25. For years, the Buffalo Bills spent ample time building a prominent contender, and now they have an elite club. Anchoring the offense, Pro Bowl quarterback Jim Kelly. Running back, the incredible Thurman Thomas. Wide receiver, the exciting Andre Reed. The sixth best offensive line in the league, led by Ken Hull and Will Wolford. And on defense, just as dangerous, a man who, like LT, can drop a QB on a dime and add that all-important pressure, the 1990 Defensive Player of the Year, Bruce Smith. And that insanely underrated linebacking core of Cornelius Bennett, Darryl Talley, and Shane Conlon were all present as well, and leading the defensive backs, Nate Odoms. The Giants, however, were still without Sims, and they were 7-point underdogs. As the Bills' offense was significantly better on paper, well, at least to the odds makers, it's easy to see why. So here we go. January 27, 1991, Tampa Bay, Florida, Super Bowl 25. It was clear what the Giants had to do. Don't let the Bills get the ball. It's a strategy that has gotten them to this point. The Giants consumed over 6 minutes on a 10-play drive that led to a field goal, but the Bills, doing what they do, quickly moved the ball to tie it. It's 3-3, and that's how it would stay after one quarter. But late in that very quarter, however, the Jim Kelly Andre Reed show was starting to take center stage, and into the early portion of the second quarter, the Bills made it 10-3 after a 1-yard TD run by Don Smith. The Bills took full control when Bruce Smith sacked Hostetler in the end zone, giving the Bills a 12-3 lead. It looked as if they found a way to expose the Giants' strategy. But then the Giants made them pay, shocking their defense. With a quick drive near the end of the second quarter, 87 yards, and Hostetler finds Stephen Baker in the end zone 14 yards out, the Giants only trail at halftime by 2. But then the Giants went back to their winning formula in the third quarter, because now they were able to do something with momentum on their side. 14 plays, 75 yards, culminating in a 1-yard TD by Otis Anderson. And it killed a Super Bowl record 9 minutes and 29 seconds off the clock, and the Giants lead 17-12 after 3 quarters. But again, Buffalo stuns the Giants with a big 31-yard touchdown run by Thurman Thomas. But the boys killed over 7 minutes on the clock once again. Bears' field goal gave them the lead back, but only by 1 point, 20-19. The Giants shockingly failed to run out the clock, and the Bills had one more chance. And here we go. With 8 seconds to play, the Bills could send the Giants packing the way they got there by a last-second field goal. 47 yards out, the kick was up, and the 2 words echo that still haunt Buffalo Bills fans to this very day. Wide right. The Giants win the Super Bowl. LT played a very solid game, but overall was the entire team defense that made this thing happen. Plus a smart offense as Hostetler stepped up. Then MVP Otis Anderson killing time off the clock as well. And much credit goes to Bill Belichick for his defense not letting the Bills keep the ball. Now LT had another Super Bowl ring to call his own. LT's 10.5 sacks were down from his previous marks in the last few seasons, but he was still one of the best in the world at what he does. Once again, Randall Cunningham, who had another Pro Bowl season, had another 3 sacks logged in against him as LT's success against the Vikings continued. Future Pro Bowler Rich Gannon had his first meeting against the legend, resulting in 2 sacks, while future Hall of Famers Troy Aikman and Dan Marino, the latter of whom was protected by the top offensive line in the league, was also caught with LT in his face. His sack on Frank Reich infiltrated Buffalo's 6th best offensive line, while he also continued to have luck against Detroit and division rival Phoenix. Also, Joe Montana incurred the wrath of a Giants defense in the playoffs that forever changed his career, and LT was a huge part of that happening. A huge year, his 2nd Super Bowl ring topping it all off. For only the 2nd time in his career, however, he is not a first-team All-Pro, but indeed is still a 2nd-team All-Pro for the 2nd time, meaning he's been a member of either All-Pro team 10 years straight, and sets an NFL record at the time with his 10th straight Pro Bowl selection. Now at 31 years old, LT was still producing at a high level, even if it wasn't what we were used to, but he'd have to prepare for more changes. After the season was over, Bill Parcells decided to retire, well, at least for the first time anyway. Also another huge loss, Bill Belichick was done as defensive coordinator, taking a head coaching job in Cleveland for the Browns. Longtime assistant Roy Hanley took over as head coach. The Giants were shrouded in uncertainty, and LT now, with 10 seasons under his belt, having accomplished a great deal of his career winning the highest honors, still felt he had a lot left. The Giants opened the season against their heated rivals, the 49ers, on Monday Night Football, and made it a long night for QB Steve Young. And again, it was a late game field goal that sunk the Niners, this time at Giants Stadium, starting the season with a bang. But then the Giants suffered back-to-back losses to the Rams and the Bears, where in the former LT recorded a sack. They rebounded with a win over the Browns, however, as the Giants' defense pulverized Bernie Kosar, while Belichick watched his work do damage to now his new team. LT had 2 sacks. After that, despite getting to Troy Aikman, LT and the Giants dropped a loss to the Dallas Cowboys, meaning they already had 3 losses. That was their entire total last season. He had another sack as the Giants moved to 3-3, however, in a win over the Cardinals. A win over the Steelers and a loss against the Redskins put the Giants at 4-4. And obviously this was a huge disappointment, but they were still very much in playoff contention. LT seemed to be struggling, however, and it was evident that the team's loss against the Eagles, a team he normally played very well against, to boot. However, against the Cardinals, he played a great game, and then they followed that up with a huge 22-9 win over this revamped Dallas Cowboys team. The Redskins were about to lock up the division, however, but this 3-way tie in the NFC East at 6-5 could possibly make the wild card very interesting. It wasn't just LT, as it was the Giants as a whole who were having trouble adjusting to much of the changes on this team. All 3 teams won the next week, as the Giants scored a win over lowly Tampa, where LT and Pepper Johnson made life miserable for Vinny Testaverde. But then, what followed was 3 straight losses, and the Giants were eliminated from playoff contention. LT sat out the loss against the Bengals, had nothing going for him against the Eagles or the Redskins, the latter of whom eventually won the Super Bowl. The Giants were eliminated. LT did not play in the win over Houston. His 7 sacks are the first time he only hit single digits since 1983, the lowest official sack total of his career. He still had an impressive resume, however, as every QB that LT sacked would be a Pro Bowler at some point in their career. And the Rams are the 10th best offensive line in the league, as LT still had Everett's number. Now, Kosar and Tupa were his biggest targets that year, and while Tupa, like the rest, is indeed a Pro Bowler, as it was indeed as a punter. That's why I haven't really labeled him as such. Well, Taylor didn't play bad. It was a far cry from the man we were used to seeing, however. A career low in sacks, missing the playoffs for the 5th time in his career, and not one single accolade. His string of 10 Pro Bowls came to an end, his string of 10 All-Pro selections came to an end as well. Was it a sign of things to come? So now the discussion of LT being on the downswing of his career was surfacing in the media. Again, he didn't have a bad year, just not a great one. But of course, the negative gets magnified when you've had as much success as he's had. And going into the 1992 season, the Giants were considered a middle-of-the-road, maybe they will, maybe they won't make the playoffs type team. The Giants' defense, while still good, wasn't as dominant anymore, but either way, they were going to give it a go, and LT was not quite ready to pack it in. Sadly, the season got off to a bad start, despite LT pretty much crushing Steve Young in a 31-14 loss at home to the Niners. And then they went down 34-0 in a game against the Dallas Cowboys, but that's not how it ended. They made a huge comeback, but still lost 34-28. They got their first win of the year over the Chicago Bears, but fell to 1-3 after a loss to the Raiders. They then bounced back with a win over Phoenix, but fall back after a loss to the Rams. The Giants then go on a roll. A win over the pathetic Seahawks, defending Super Bowl champions, and the rivals the Redskins are next. And then a young Packers team. LT had a sack in all 3 games, looking like his old self again. And going into that Green Bay game, he got a lot of headlines with how well he was playing. And hey, he formally welcomed Brett Favre to the NFL with a sack. But during that game, something happened. LT ruptured his Achilles tendon later in the game. And on the field, writhing in pain, the 70,000 plus at Giants Stadium, who roared every time LT made a big play, had never been so silent since his career had begun. He was carted off the field, and in the midst of having a great year and looking like he'd return the Giants to prominence, it was over just like that, and his overall career looked to be in jeopardy. This kind of injury is usually either one of 2 things, a career changer or a career ender, very little in between or anything better. And at 33 years old, many thought LT was done, and the media had pretty much agreed. The Giants went 1-6 without him, finishing 6-10, missed the playoffs yet again. He was looking like his old self before he went down, with 5 sacks in 9 games and still an impressive lineup. 2 Hall of Fame QBs in Steve Young and young Brett Favre. And speaking of Young, he and Ripien, who was an old favorite target of LT's, who hadn't gotten to him in a little while, had the 2nd and 7th best offensive lines in the league. And of course, the polar opposites, Todd Marinovich and Steve Gelba, rounded out. What looked like it was going to be a rebound year ended up being probably the most heartbreaking of his career. LT, who still recorded a very impressive 5 sacks in 9 games, was showing people he was far from finished, but now, he may very well be. LT was very non-committal about his future despite several questions about him as to where he stood. Was he done? Was it truly the end? And he hinted somewhat that he might be ready to retire. However, he was also looking for a new contract. He hinted at that as well. It was typical LT behavior. Perhaps though he really was conflicted. Perhaps he was playing mind games with the media. Maybe it was a bit of both. Who knows? However, the Giants hired a new coach, Dan Reeves, who had spent 12 seasons and made 3 Super Bowl appearances as the head coach of the Denver Broncos. Apparently, this was a tipping point for LT, thinking Reeves could help the team turn around. And also, he didn't want to end his career due to an injury. He knew it would be a risk coming back, but ultimately, decided to return for a 13th season. And he looked fantastic in a very exciting 26-20 win over the Bears to begin the season with 1.5 sacks, playing with that all-too-familiar fire once again. You can see his injuries slowed down his speed, but it didn't slow down his ferocity. Then a 23-7 win over the Bucs and a 20-10 win over the Rams. The Giants were 3-0 to start the season. The streak came to a halt in a very defensive battle with the very team the Giants beat in the Super Bowl a few years ago, the Buffalo Bills, narrowly losing 17-14. But LT did what he could not do in that Super Bowl game, that's drive Jim Kelly to the turf a couple of times while he stole the ball in his hand, and the Giants decimated their division rivals. After that, the Redskins 41-7, and the Eagles 21-10 to move to 5-1. But the best offensive line in the league, their rival, the New York Jets, stalled them 10-6. The defending Super Bowl champion Cowboys crushed them 31-9. And the Giants now sit at 5-3 and are still very much in the thick of things, even regarding the division, as they still had the Cowboys in their sights. And then a huge 6-game winning streak. First, a dominant win over the Redskins, a very defensive 7-3 win over the Eagles. It took a late field goal to beat the underdog Cardinals, but 3 big wins over division rivals nonetheless. LT reacquainted himself with an old favorite target, Steve DeBerg, in a win over Miami as DeBerg was substituting for injured Dan Marino. And after a win over Indy, LT reacquainted himself with Wade Wilson of the New Orleans Saints in a 24-14 win. They would drop a loss to the Cardinals the following week, and yet they were guaranteed a playoff spot. They wanted the division title, and as luck would have it, going into the final week, they were taking on their heated rivals to fight for said title, the Dallas Cowboys. It didn't look good early as the Giants fell behind 13-0 by halftime. And then, in the second half, LT and the boys were gunning for Aikman, and hey, our boy got him. And the offense responded, and the Giants only trailed by 3 at 13-10. They tied it in the fourth quarter, and the game was headed to overtime. Sadly, it didn't take the Cowboys long. The Giants lose the division, but still have a date in the playoffs, and LT records what would be his final regular season sack. He records it on a future Hall of Famer at the top of his game, and not to mention going past the 4th best offensive line in the league. The Giants finished 11-5, but would have to settle for the wildcard round. They will host the Minnesota Vikings. They had an effective 2 QB system they utilized all year with former Super Bowl champion Jim McMahon and former Grey Cup champion of the CFL Sean Salisbury. But they were throwing to one of the best receivers in the game, Chris Carter. But their defense was where it was at, led by 2 Pro Bowl defensive linemen Chris Dolman and John Randall. You also had defensive backs Carl Lee and Audrey McMillan. A game had significant winds in the weather that took place at Giants Stadium. The Giants had the win at their back and were able to muster up the only points of the quarter and went up 3-0. They had a chance to go up 6-0, but the win affected Mark Treadwell's field goal attempt sailing wide, and the Vikings responded and went up 7-3 with a touchdown, and then added a field goal and they led 10-3 at the half. But the big turning point was Rodney Hampton. The young running back scampered for a huge 51-yard rushing touchdown, adding to what would be a huge day for him, and the game is tied. Hampton would score another big TD, and the Giants led 17-10 after 3 quarters. The Vikings looked poised to tie it late in the fourth quarter as Salisbury came into the game and made a huge completion to Chris Carter, who looked like he was going to score a touchdown, but Byron Guyton caught up, knocking the ball out of his hands. It was then recovered by Greg Jackson, and the Giants held on to win. A big game for the Giants defense as LT continued to journey in hopes of winning one more championship. And if that was the case, he's going to do it alongside with a defensive player looking to take the mantle from him in the future, a rookie by the name of Michael Strahan. And look who's awaiting them. In the divisional playoff, it's the NFC West title holders yet again, the San Francisco 49ers. However, things have changed a bit. Gone were the days of Joe Montana. Now Steve Young was anchoring the team, trying to prove himself after years of being his backup. Jerry Rice is still Jerry Rice, but now you're getting some big games from tight end Brent Jones. You also have a 1,000-yard running back now with Ricky Waters. An amazing offensive line of Harris Barton, Guy McIntyre, and Jesse Salo. A defense that featured youngsters Ted Washington and Dana Stubblefield up front. Romanowski was still a linebacker, and they had acquired Cardinals Pro Bowler Tim McDonald as strong safety as Ronnie Lott was now gone. It was a brutal game, however, for the Giants all around. 2 picks thrown by Sims, who himself had a resurgent year, and backup Dave Brown threw 1 to boot. Rodney Hampton, after 161 yards the prior week, had just 12. The Giants were held to 41 yards rushing compared to 178 by the Niners, who went on to win 44-3. It was not the end LT was looking for, and indeed, many knew the end was coming, as at the end of the game, TV cameras caught an emotional LT on the sidelines in near tears. And shortly after the game ended, he made the announcement, "I think it's time for me to retire. I've done everything I can do. I've been to Super Bowls. I've been to playoffs. I've done things that other people haven't been able to do in this game before. After 13 years, it's time for me to go." His final 6 sacks, however, were all against impressive caliber. All but 1 were on men who have been Pro Bowlers. 2.5, Aikman and Kelly, are Hall of Famers. The only one without those accolades is Steve DeBerg. However, he was a longtime veteran quarterback. LT first sacked him in 1984. It was part of the 3.5 sacks, more than half that LT had against top 10 offensive lines, however. This season was about LT going out on his own terms, rather than letting an injury dictate his future. Despite not being able to put out another championship team, he helped the Giants get back to the playoffs. And a very underrated defensive core this time, who allowed the least amount of points in the league, yet had no Pro Bowlers. Heesh. Either way, still not a bad way to end a great career. Officially, LT recorded 132.5 sacks in his career. When he retired, he was only behind Reggie White, who was still active as the all-time leader. And his 5 favorite targets, 4 were Pro Bowlers. And of course, they were all division rivals. Randall Cunningham was dropped 13.5 times, while his old mentor Ron Jaworski was taken down 10.5 times, while Cardinal legend Neil Lomax was taken down just half less than that. Joe Theismann, of course, is now in infamy due to LT sacks. And the only non-Pro Bowl QB in this list is Gary Hogaboom. In his division, there were not many Hall of Fame QBs he played against during his era, but most of them, as you just saw, were Pro Bowlers. That being said, he still committed sacks against Hall of Famers 9 times. The most, however, was the only Hall of Famer in his division he ever faced, Troy Aikman. Also, non-Hall of Fame Pro Bowl QBs, which is what this category has been all through these videos, 18 sacks in their Pro Bowl years, very good number, plus a huge 32.5 sacks on QBs who were formerly Pro Bowlers, and for future Pro Bowlers, 21.5, also a great number, and 20.5 sacks to top it off against top 10 offensive lines, a very good number as well. That's nearly 15.5%. Now for playoffs. LT didn't actually record too many playoff sacks, but his record is very impressive. 10-5 in 7 playoff appearances, and in 6, at least won 1 game. He still had 6.5 sacks in those games, and just about half were on a man he never sacked in the regular season, Joe Montana, who always usually had a great offensive line in front of him to boot. Indeed, Lawrence Taylor stuck to his retirement, and speaking of retire, the very next year he had his number retired by the New York Giants. Also, the 1994 season, the 75th anniversary of the NFL, LT was named to the 75th anniversary team on top of it all. But of course, LT never stayed too far away from the spotlight, and was still indulging in a wild lifestyle. However, in 1995, he memorably entered the world of professional wrestling, something he had been a fan of for many years. I remember all this. The world of pro wrestling wasn't setting the world on fire in early 1995, and the World Wrestling Federation tried bringing new eyes to its product. And indeed, many sports media outlets were reporting when LT was sitting in the front row during the Royal Rumble pay-per-view in January of 1995 and was shoved by wrestler Bam Bam Bigelow, and a match between the two was set up for WrestleMania 11. LT took the world of professional wrestling very seriously and professionally, training hard for the match, and it did have quite a buzz around it. LT performed very well in the match, which he won, likely in hopes maybe that a wrestling career could pan out. The show did only so-so numbers, however. Some say it was a combination of several factors, that LT, while famous, wasn't the type of celebrity to turn things around. Despite the intrigue, not many were willing to pay to see it. Also, the fact that wrestling was just drowning at this time. LT was also in and out of rehab that same year, which also could have been a factor as to why he never pursued a full-time career in wrestling. However, his late 90s approach, he tried straightening himself out and looked to be on the right path. He took up golf as a hobby. He also pursued a career in broadcasting, not just football, but other sports. Hollywood came calling. He appeared as himself in a smash hit 1998 Adam Sandler comedy, The Waterboy. He really tested his acting chops in the gritty Oliver Stone football drama Any Given Sunday, which starred Al Pacino in 1999. He also appeared in the movie Shaft, as well as himself in the hit TV series The Sopranos on HBO. He also memorably voiced former football player B.J. Smith in the smash hit video game Grand Theft Auto Vice City. On his first year of eligibility, a very healthy-looking LT was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1999. Some are thinking that his history of off-field antics may delay his enshrinement, but thankfully that wasn't the case. In 2003, he released a very candid autobiography which didn't shy away from the wild and dangerous life he led, and a scene, however, that was all left behind. Unfortunately, it didn't last. Numerous run-ins with the law that included driving violations and accidents, and worst of all, an encounter with a young prostitute that resulted in him having to register as a low-risk offender. LT, however, now just seems unapologetic about who he is, and has even auctioned off a lot of his memorabilia that he had accumulated. Despite the controversy, he was still, into the ire and anger of many on social media, named to the NFL's 100th anniversary team. As of the making of this video, Lawrence Taylor is 63 years old, and some say it's a miracle he's even made it this far. Despite his careless and often, well, downright idiotic ways off the field, nobody can dispute what a warrior he was on it, and just how focused he was in any given game he played. He may have been a giant headache, but he was also a giant presence in his illustrious 13-year career. It's amazing how he managed not to let his lifestyle affect his overall play and his career. That does it for our look at Lawrence Taylor, the man known as LT. Our next NFL player bio will be on another pass rusher who came from the similar era. And as I mentioned earlier, like LT, he was a great player, but unlike LT, his personality and lifestyle were a complete 180. I'm talking about the Minister of Defense, Reggie White. Look forward to that one. In the meantime, please like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'll see ya!